Hello, welcome, friends and relations. Hi, Lena.
Hi,
Nice to see you.
there you are. Hi. Yeah, good to
Yeah,
see you too.
let's see. Can I see everybody? Um, and Sam, you're like a regular now. It's so great.
There we
Okay,
go. This helps.
there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
stoink. I may have to duck out for an international phone call, but I wanted to say
Okay,
thanks so much for this session, and I'll follow up.
great. And there's Jeff, our fearless president of the Working Class Studies Association.
Hello, Betsy. Hi.
Hi, Jeff. I liked how every time the announcements went out, Jeff would put a heart on it. So I'd get this reply that was just a heart. Oh, and my friend Jan is here. This is great. And Lainey. Yeah, great. I see some familiar faces and also maybe some first timers. Oh, here's Jen Vernon, who's the past president of the Working Class Studies Association, still very involved in the programming. Um, Yeah, welcome to everybody who's new, and this is your first time to a Talking Class webinar, but also welcome to our regulars. So if you want to put into the chat where you're located, and then if you want to,
Hello. Oh, thank you.
and if you could stay muted until we open it up for discussion, if you could write in the chat something about how your class background has impacted your working life, which is our topic tonight. Oh, Iona's from London. We actually have a lot of UK um, uh, registrants. So this is very exciting. This is going to be an international conversation. Yeah, please. Oh, Canada too. We got 3 countries and growing. Um, so if you're just joining us, we're writing in the chat our locations. And then if you want to, if you feel like there's something to say about our topic today, say something about how your class background has affected your work life. So far, we seem to. All right. Colin says, part of my schooling is adopted beginning to work in my field in tandem with studies similar to trade schools. Cool. Oh, Jacob, or maybe it's not how you pronounce it, from Budapest. That class background affects you in ways that you don't pay attention to. Yeah, we deny and ignore the importance of socioeconomic class in affecting our lives. Okay, this is if you're oh, and Pink Flowers says for better and for worse. And Stacy says, how hasn't it affected my working life all the ways? So yeah, if you're just arriving, I encourage you to look in the chat, and we're seeing a lot of the locations, but also people about how their class background has affected their lives. Lainey said, I didn't understand the huge possibilities of career trajectory. And Paul Dean, who was a Talking Class guest speaker in a prior month, Paul says, as a professor, some of my closest friends on campus work in buildings and grounds. Yeah. All right. The chat is getting really delicious here.
Betsy, can I add?
Yeah.
Colin Hoffman from Aurora, Colorado. Part of my schooling has adopted beginning to work in my field in tandem with studies similar to trade schools.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really appropriate today.
And Jeff says, our fearless president of Working Class Studies Association, says, I feel I exist in 2 separate worlds, the academy and my family back home. So many first-gen students feel that way, people who were first-gen. And yet, Mellow Yellow, Big Blue Swallow says, I grew up low income, so my family benefited from a lot of public programs many of my college peers never had to take. And Jen says, the past president of Working Class Studies Association, is saying, oops, I scrolled away from you, Jen. Yeah.
Type in for a second. Yeah.
Class impacted my family, version of religion, food, schooling, and jobs. Yeah, we're talking about something that impacts our lives in so many different ways.
I like what Samuel Ocasio Jr. is saying. Being from a working class Latino community, I'm always aware of my class and how I enter spaces. I think that maybe the intersection of class and race.
Yeah. That's great that you're bringing that intersection in. All right. Yeah, we're up to 50 people. Just give people another couple minutes to come in and then we'll start our program. But yeah, Tommy says, colleagues often assume I have savings or rainy day money. And then people are putting emojis on that one. Yeah, feel free to react to each other's messages. These are really great. Yeah, we have a record-breaking number of people registered for this, and I think it's just a topic that has really, really hit home for a lot of people. All right, let me close down the share so we can see each other and do some introductions. Look at this big, beautiful group. So, I'm Betsy Leondar-Wright. I co-coordinate the Talking Class webinar series with Jack Metzger, who unfortunately is not able to be with us tonight. And so my co-facilitator tonight is Terry Easton, who is the treasurer of the Working Class Studies Association, which is our sponsor tonight. So appreciation to Terry for stepping into the role. Do you want to introduce yourself a little, Terry, and then I'll introduce Allison?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Great to see you tonight. Thank you for coming. I teach in the English department at the University of North Georgia. And even though I'm in English department, I'm sort of interdisciplinary trained in history and literature, oral history, a bit of sociology, but I wouldn't call myself a sociologist, but I like reading sociology. So I'm glad to be here tonight.
Yeah, we are multidisciplinary here, even though tonight is about sociologists for the most part. We are actually it's a multidisciplinary network, working class studies. So let me introduce our guest speaker. We are really pleased and honored to have Allison Hurst with us tonight. She's a professor of sociology at Oregon State University and the author of a number of awesome books related to first-gen college students and what happens to them later in life. And the one that I first read and love is called The Burden of Academic Success. Isn't that quite the title? And so Allison is a past president of the Working Class Studies Association and still a stalwart member. So some of us have been sort of following this research that she's been doing and getting really intrigued and interested in what it's revealing about how our class background affects us in our whole lives. It's really special. So yeah, so we're gonna now, how this is gonna go is Terry and I are gonna ask Allison some questions, and then she's gonna do a presentation about her research findings. Then we'll have some more questions for her. And then we'll open it up for discussion. But at any point, put comments in the chat or questions in the chat. We'll stay attentive to the chat and see if there's things that pop up. But we'll try to save the last 20 minutes or more for a discussion question and for just whatever reactions you have. So yeah, so I want to ask a question that establishes you and your work in another way, Allison. So Allison and I are both in the American Sociological Association, ASA, and a few years ago, it set up a task force to study first generation and working class students and faculty in the discipline of sociology. So that is, yeah, I was just curious if you could tell us how that came about and what your role has been in making that task force happen.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure to be here, and it's lovely to see all of your faces. I was actually texting with my father, who's also on here, which is very exciting for me. And I don't think he's connected to audio, so I was trying to troubleshoot that. He doesn't use Zoom very often. So you're taping it. Yeah, I'll just send it to my parents later. So I've been studying class in college since grad school, when I was trying to figure out what I was doing in grad school, and especially when I was trying to have conversations with my mother about what I was studying and she didn't understand it. And I'm like, what is the point of this if I can't talk to people I love? So I ended up really just focusing on how do working class students survive in college and grad school and beyond, and wrote several books on college students. And now I'm at this, looking at faculty. But it was probably 2016 that I was at an ASA, the American Sociological Association meeting, and there was just a sort of panel discussion about inequality that had nothing to do with class. And it was a little bewildering to me. And so I started thinking about how ASA should take more attention to class. They're sociologists. So I rounded up a bunch of people. Some of you on here might have been people I rounded up to write a letter to ASA imploring them to do something, to have a status committee on first gen working class persons or something. And they created a task force to decide whether or not class is an issue, which I thought was a little funny. But so I got myself on the task force. And to their credit, most of the people on the task force were people who identified in some way as coming from either a background of poverty or working class background, working class academic, or first in their family to go to college. And we're very open. It was very sort of open about, we don't even have a good grounding of what that term should be at this point as sociologists. So the task force got together, was convened, and then I think in 2018, it started holding focus groups with different first-gen working class faculty at the ASA meeting. A lot of really interesting stuff came out of that, including confirmation that class matters in our academic lives, as you all just said, and as we all probably already knew. And then with that confirmation, the task force created a survey that went out to more than 2,000 ASA members. We have a couple papers that sort of were generated from that. And then of those 2,000 people that were interviewed, they were actually of all class backgrounds. We're really looking at continuing gen faculty, first gen faculty, comparing results. From those, we reached out to a couple hundred to see if they wanted to be interviewed. And so I want to give a credit to Elizabeth Lee, who isn't here, and Jose Munoz, two sociologists who've been working with me on doing this interview part of the project. Both of us, all three of us, were on the task force. The task force is technically completed now. We put in a report that said, yes, class matters. And ASA created a community. So we now have a community of first gen working class persons in sociology. So they're kind of working on a new model and giving us a little bit of space in the program and in the organization to keep talking about class and keep raising questions about it in ASA and sociology. So yeah, that's the sort of background of the study. And later on, I guess I'll be talking to you a little bit about some of those things that are coming out from the interviews, most of which will not surprise you. But for me, a lot of my career has been documenting things that working class academics have known for a long time and they've written about. I see Barb Jensen, there's other people in here who've written really great stories, memories, histories, and interviews with people, working class academics. But it hasn't reached a point at the top of the discipline where that is very well established yet. So that, given like ASA still had to figure out does class matter? Um, and so I'm just trying to sort of like build that momentum in the discipline and in the academy to take class seriously at all stages, including academics, not just looking at poverty as an issue, but looking at class and the lived experiences of everyone, including academics.
Great.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Allison, to get us started. We're going to get to the task force findings in a few minutes, but I'm curious, wouldn't some other academic fields benefit from similar task force studies? Why
Um,
just sociology?
Yes. And at the time, the task force was putting things together. An article in Nature came out, which I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but we can give you the link later. But what Betsy has just put up here on your screen is a chart that came from this Nature article that was published a couple of years ago now, or maybe 4 years ago now, showing that faculty on average are 25 times more likely than the average American to have parents with PhDs, not even college degrees, with PhDs. That sort of confirms what a lot of people have sort of felt about the academy being full of people who have long connections to academia. And so one of the things you can see here is how all the disciplines have this problem, not just sociology. And in fact, sociology is actually more class inclusive, more diverse in terms of the faculty than but not by much. So if there's a problem in sociology, there's a problem in every academic discipline, which is not going to be a surprise to anyone here, but some people still need to hear that. And I will say, a couple of years ago, Michelle Corbin, who was also a president of WICSA, she and I were invited to give a talk about how class matters in academic success to a convention of astrophysicists, which we found very exciting. LIGO is their annual conference at Caltech. And so we basically gave a sort of talked some of the things I'm going to talk about today, but then also talking about why it matters, specifically in terms of equity, democratic publics, and wasted talent, all the ways that class is a barrier to advancement within astrophysics. So yes, I think every field could be helped by paying more attention to class in their own backyard.
Yeah, thank you for that. It reminds me when I was on the job market. I'm from a first gen working class family, and it's hard for first gen people to go on the job market and feel like they're competing with what you're saying here. I think the numbers show of a lot of PhDs out there who have been born into this and therefore may have the confidence that perhaps we don't have.
Absolutely.
So
Thank you.
can you tell us some about what the sociology, the ASA task force found?
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking there's kind of an obvious answer, and then there's some things that are less obvious. So interestingly, I think a lot of people that don't have a background that has any sort of economic insecurity assume that the primary difference is money. And obviously, money matters, but it's by far not the main thing. We did find that there are differences in the comparing first gen working class faculty in sociology to continuing gen middle class raised faculty, just in general. And there's a lot of ways to break that down. But in general, working class faculty are less likely to have tenured positions. They're less likely that within any given position, they make less money. That kind of confirms what Sam Friedman and Daniel Lorison found in the class ceiling in the UK. Um, so that's definitely a finding. But more than those material aspects, actually, someone on the chat already mentioned this. There was a lot more debt. There is a lot more debt among people who didn't have families that helped them pay for things. And there's also we found a weird reverse transfer of money from grad students on through tenured faculty to their families, which is the opposite of how a lot of continuing gen faculty and grad students receive money from their parents to help them through. And it's the reverse for us. A lot of us are giving back to our families. And so it's a sort of negative drain on, so there's less money and then you're also giving more of it back. So there's that. But those things are real. The productivity of first gen faculty, like who's publishing and who's doing things, that actually was fairly muted. And I think it's because working class faculty like work really hard. Any differences can be sort of explained in different pathways. I'll talk more about that later. But the real big difference is in how first gen working class faculty feel in the academy, the cultural aspects, the feeling like an imposter sometime, or feeling marginalized, or feeling like there are invisible barriers that they're unaware of how to sort of get around or how to surmount. The difficulties in particular of straddling between working class families and middle class academic lives. Those are things that sort of come up over and over again. And so in a survey, it's hard to capture all of that, but we did have an open-ended question that was like, does class matter? If you said yes, how? And so we have a lot of sort of smaller qualitative data, these text responses to that question. And so there's a paper that should be coming out soon about that. But those, the more cultural, the more psychological, the feelings of discomfort, the burden of academic success, those are things that really come out in the interviews beyond the surveys, right? So the task force has more of the sort of like very basic, we make less money and we have more debt, and the deeper stuff comes out of the interviews.
Allison, I can't help looking in the chat, and I saw Carrie, who said that Carrie's had to learn many upper class ways of being now as postgraduate work, many upper class ways of being and research norms. So that's sort of feelings, but it's also the work also. So it's kind of borderline, right? So it's very powerful stuff. Yeah.
It is, yeah. And it's hard to pin down and it's hard to talk about too sometimes, which we'll get into more later, I'm sure.
All right. I do have another question for you then. So let's talk about the particular study that you're now doing with Elizabeth Lee and Jose Munoz, which you mentioned. It's titled Class and Field Effects in the Careers of Sociologists. And it's focused specifically on first gen and working class faculty. First, what are class and field effects?
Yeah, so Jose and Liz and I together, combined with all of our students that helped us on this project, have interviewed more than 150 sociologists now at all stages of their careers, so grad students to emeritus professors, and getting that richer data, right? The experiences of discomfort and straddling and all those different aspects of being a working class academic. But one thing that sort of struck us early, the more we got into the data, was how people's understanding of themselves in the academy was dependent upon where in the academy they were. If you think of the academy as a field, and so that's a sort of Bourdieusian thing. If we can get into Bourdieu a little bit later, if you want, he's my favorite theorist. So this idea that we can understand sort of the relationship between individual agency that people have and the structures that constrain them by thinking in terms of fields. And then you can sort of see field effects on individual choices. So what I sort of mean by that, and I see Betsy has put up these. Do you want to, should I go and talk about the tracks, Betsy?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. So feel free
Okay.
to launch in that it's really interesting that you found these 4 different class inflected tracks. So yeah, why don't you tell us more about that and just tell me when to advance the slides?
Okay, sure. So, answering Terry's question there about how what a field effect is. So sort of thinking before I draw the field for you, I'll sort of show you that we ended up clumping people into these different clusters based on their experience in the academy and specifically their pathway through. So where they went to grad school, where they ended up, what kind of work they're doing. Are they doing teaching? Are they doing research at an R1? Are they at an elite place? Those things seem to really matter when they talked about how difficult it was to be in the academy. People who were in places that were close to their home communities, the local college, for example, who still were able to go home for dinner with their parents, right? And can go to their niece's birthday party, which I can't because I'm out thousands of miles away. Their experience is a little bit different than people who are on, let's say, a super elite track, and they often are very far away from their families and in a different universe culturally, and they feel it, and they feel like they're in a different cultural universe. They feel like they've gone to a different planet. And so we notice that, just asking questions about what it's like to be first gen or working class in the academy, it makes sense to sort of think about these different trajectories and the destinations of people, and then sort of try to figure out what's causing that, what implications there are about that, what's important about that. So to set up the four kinds on this sort of slide here for you, the public teachers were a very, very large group. We don't have the full 150 coded on here, so that's why we only have whatever that number is, about 70 on there. But so the public teachers are the vast majority of the people that we've interviewed. I have to say, before I even break that down, for those of you like numbers, that the group of people that we're interviewing are people who are dues-paying ASA members, and it costs a lot to pay dues every year to ASA. So we're not capturing like the people that are a lot of people in the discipline. We're capturing people in the discipline who still have sufficient resources to be a member and are still energized enough about the discipline to want to pay those dues. So that's a specific subset. So in that though, even in our subset, the bulk of our working class persons were public teachers, which is meant that they often went to a public school, public college uh, near themselves, and then ended up at like the flagship at the most, or it could be a small teaching college that's near them. So they might have gone to a small regional college in Nebraska and ended up at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, or something like that. And uh, maybe not oddly, a lot of white females end up in this category. And there's something about the ways that these people talk about giving service back to their local communities and the sort of joy of being a teacher serving students that look like them. All right. And so their understanding of what it is to be a sociologist and how class matters is a lot about giving back. Upwardly mobile are people we sort of categorize as going to schools that were harder to access, not the local school necessarily. It could have been a liberal arts college, or it could have been starting at a flagship, and then really trying for that publisher parish, lifestyle, trying to move up, trying to get jobs that are at more distinguished places, whatever that means, but really thinking about it that way. Um, and a lot of them were very disgruntled. Their experience was, their understanding of what it is to be a first-gen working class faculty kind of differed based on where they were. If they're just starting out, there's a lot of promise. If they're near the end, they're like, wow, was that worth it? I left my family, like what, like, right? So very different. There were some people who were at elite institutions, like very top, because again, this is ASA, very top, who had started at elite colleges Often they were heavily mentored and they were on this upward trajectory from a young age, and they understood that they were on this upward trajectory. And they, some of them are at the top of their field, like people that I was intimidated interviewing. And a lot of these were older white men. And I think there's a lot of explanations for that. Part of it is time. When they were coming up in the academy, there were more positions open at the top for new entrants. And so there's fewer sociologists that are on that elite track. They get, if they're ambitious, they're on the upperly mobile, but not necessarily elite. And then sadly, there were some, these are still dues paying members. So there's probably many more of these outside of ASA who had attempted some form of upward mobility through education. They had thought about it that way, and it didn't work at all. Often these were people who like had no mentors, and it was very clear that they had no mentors. And many times they even had people actively fighting against their success in the academy. Faculty of color, there were a lot of broke faculty of color. Um, when they stay in the academy, they're often adjunct, non-tenure track. 40% of them were outside of academia entirely, still with some hopes to get back in, or they wouldn't be paying dues for ASA. So they were the angriest of the group, and um, what was interesting too, comparing them to public teachers, is they often had been in very elite spaces. So they might have started at a really top school and then had it not pay off. So they don't have the same experience of, I'm going to be at a local school and give back to my community, because they've been sucked up into this like vacuum of prestige and then like left on the ground. So that's what I mean by broke. So it's a very distinct sort of pathway. Um, so I guess, Betsy, if you want to like, I have a slide for each one of these, or no, I don't have a slide. I have, you can think about the field now, and maybe this will make more sense thinking about these four people. This is the field as I constructed in US sociology, but I think it's probably pretty similar in other academic disciplines in the US. It might be different outside of the US because uh, different higher educational systems look different. The US is very stratified. We have public, we have private, and we have 3,500 institutions of higher education. I mean, and it's a sort of a Wild West out there. But if you could sort of think about the American system of higher education, we have on one axis the sort of private, Harvard's, Yale's, Princeton's, expensive, high reward if you're teaching at those or doing research at those. And then on the other hand, we have public, and we have various stratification within public, but obviously less remunerative, right? And then on another axis, you have research intensive versus teaching intensive. And academic faculty, often we talk and compare about our teaching loads and our research loads. I have been at teaching colleges. I have now I'm at an R1 that doesn't really do that much research. So like I sort of see the gamut there. But if you sort of think of this, the private, high remunerative and research intensive, they're the sort of peak on the top right there. And from the survey, we saw that a lot of the upper class and upper middle class sociologists were clustered there. That's sort of the home of second, third, fourth generation sociologists. And that's the eyes on the prize, as they tell you in grad school, where you want to end up. On the bottom left, you have teaching intensive public, and working class and lower middle class entrants are overrepresented there. So there's a class stratification within academia that's happening. The field is being reconstructed with every generation. And there are, I think, historical shifts, but it's pretty polarized at this point in time. What that means is that if you are a working class first gen grad student going into the field of sociology, that top right quadrant is scary. It is culturally alien to you. And there are many reasons why people, for comfort, will want to go to the lower left quadrant. which often is more representative of people that look and sound like them, like you. And so there's a little bit of amor fati, the love of one's fate, which is a little controversial. And Jack and I had some conversation about this. So there's some things that we can that I'm going to say about that later. But that's sort of like the sort of setup of how I am understanding the field and I'm understanding what we're seeing in these interviews. Betsy, does another one have the names of the people on them?
Yes, let me get to that one. There we go.
Okay, so I could just really briefly, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but I'll just give you a couple examples. So one of the people we interviewed, Douglas, was a man in his 70s who was, moving towards retirement and who was one of those people I was intimidated to interview. And he told a story about going to grad school in sociology back in the day that was just shocking in the ease of access compared to like what a lot of people go through today. He had stories about, yes, it was a bunch of rich people. He was the only working class person, but once he was accepted in, and they're like, "Oh, you're smart. You're one of us." He became one of them. He like literally joined the club, and he always felt like he joined the club. He did not feel like he was an outsider once they let him in. And in fact, he used and leveraged some of his blue collar mannerisms effectively as the token blue collar guy, right? And then had all the perks of being in the top echelon with all the rewards of that. And that story is just not a story that I heard much from younger faculty, from female faculty and from faculty of color, like just not as often. So
Excuse me, could people mute if your sound is if you're making sound, please mute yourself. Sorry, go ahead, Allison.
yeah. Okay. So that's sort of Douglas's example. I mean, there are definitely still some working class first gen faculty who get into elite spaces. Numerically, it's smaller, and the point really is that the alienation of the culture is very distinct compared to the bottom left. So Ellen, as a good example of a person who began at a local like the local community college, transferred into the local regional university, and then ended up teaching at, well, no, she transferred in, and then she went to grad school at the flagship, and then she ended up teaching at a regional college within 50 miles of her parents. And for her, she spends most of her time teaching. She doesn't really attempt to do research. Sociology for her is the joy and passion of teaching students things about race, class, gender, about the world, all the things that as sociologists we like talking about, and really being excited about that and getting a lot of purpose and joy out of doing that. Seeing her students as potential new sociologists, or if not that, because many of them will not go to grad school, at least she's giving them tools that will help them in the world. So Douglas and Ellen, very, very different stories. Angelina, I actually have a quote from Angelina that I want to read. She is a Latina who is assistant professor level, has aspirations for moving up. She's at an R1, but not an elite R1. And I just want to read this quote to you. She had mentorship that helped her get where she was, but then she said, "I've had many conversations with my former grad student peers about how I sort of had a lot of resentment for the career because you get tricked into thinking that you want certain things. Do I really want to live in, this elite Northeastern state? And if so, it's this weird thing. And I sometimes say, oh, we just got bamboozled." So as opposed to Ellen having this sort of like joy and connection to the students she's teaching, Angelina, who's attempting to get up to Douglas's place, has some resentment over the costs that have been involved in that movement. And plus, she's not quite there. So, and then finally, an example of Vanessa. So she is a younger Black woman who went to a very prestigious undergraduate school and a prestigious grad program, and then ended up at a teaching college at a place that's actually similar in rank and pay as Ellen, but in her feeling, she has been discarded by the discipline, right? So whereas Ellen, this was like her only aspiration, Vanessa's aspiration was very different, and she feels very stuck and discarded and marginalized. So she had no mentors. Um, and talked, one quote from her is when she was finishing undergrad and then grad school, there was no invitation. So in the way that Douglas was invited, there's no invitation for her. I learned pretty quickly nobody cared. So this sort of feeling of being isolated in the academy, no one's looking out for you, where you end up, you know, it's not good. So those are the basic uh, areas that we sort of map this field out. And yeah.
You want the next slide?
Oh, right. So I sort of want to end that little presentation. Just I said Bourdieu is my favorite theorist. And one of the reasons I love him so much is, first of all, most people don't necessarily know this, but he himself was a first gen working class person, depending on how deep you want to define that. But his grandparents were, Southern peasants in Southern France. He had an accent that marked him as different. He was a smart kid and got to the top of the system, so he was kind of like a Douglas. But then reflected on what that meant and how it happened and all of that. So this quote from him about what sociology can do, I think, is really powerful for me. And this is a quote that Jack Metzger dislikes, so we can talk about that. The true freedom that sociology offers is to give us a small chance of knowing what game we play and of minimizing the ways in which we are manipulated by the forces of the field in which we evolve, as well as by the embodied social forces that operate from within us. And so we have agency, but our agency is super constrained. And the field, in many ways, that we find ourselves in, unless we understand that we're trapped in that field, then we end up duplicating, reinscribing class and thinking that we're choosing it. So that's sort of the provocative comment I have so far on the findings that we've been finding.
Thank you, Allison.
So I do have an official question for you, but I just was reading in the chat and just a couple of things to bring up about you. You had money signs up there, and Rachel said sometimes you can make more money at a unionized public college than a private prestigious university. And then from the UK, Stacey said sometimes the prestigious universities have the shoddiest wages. So something to think about too.
Yes. Yes. And sometimes, I mean, I know at one point my husband is from New York and he wanted me to find a job in New York. It's very hard to find a job in New York. And one of the reasons it's very difficult is because the pay is not great and they're expecting people to come with money from other sources to survive in New York. So there's definitely like other geographical pockets. There's a complexity to the field. So that schematic is basically as simple as it could go, and it does gloss over a lot of those finer points.
And just one more thing, do Claude Taylor talking about the interdependence imperative. That is the idea of first gen folks wanting to give back through public teaching. That's an interesting comment.
Yeah, I mean, is it, I didn't hear the very first part of that question. Is it?
It's just really a comment that the phrase he uses, and you may know it, interdependence imperative. That is that what he finds is, or knows that first generation students want to give back.
Yeah.
And that's a working class ethic and end up in public.
It is, but it's not a universal ethic, I think. And I think again, for the Ellens and for the people who are the majority, there is something about giving back that is accords with working class culture. So it's something that is sort of followed. But it is also, how do I say this delicately? It is also a way of justifying the position you find yourself in as well. And I say that with all respect because would probably fall into the public teacher role as well. Um, that there is something that, allows the Ellens to have a more satisfying life because they can think that they're giving back, whereas the Vanessas don't don't have that sort of happiness and joy from it because they're seeing the game being played out. And the Ellens are not seeing this as a game that's being played out. So, that's kind of like what the Bourdieu is getting at is that, you kind of have to know what your choices are meaning and how they're being determined before they're fully free. Um, because there's lots of different aspects of working class culture. People pull on whichever ones that they want for very certain things, right? We're not all the same all the time and everything. So the stories that we tell about ourselves and the stories that we tell about our mobility, um, we have a whole knapsack that we can pull from. So which are the stories that we're pulling from?
I wanted to jump in there and talk about the new Arlie Hochschild book that I'm forgetting the name, but it's got the word shame in the title. It's about pride and shame, and that explaining some of the disaffected working class people in the US. And I think one of the takeaways from reading that book is like people need something to feel proud of. We all do. We need pride. And from Ellen's point of view, that is something to be proud of, giving back to the community that you come from and serving students that are like who you were. Stolen Pride. Thank you, Ariel. I couldn't remember the name, but yeah, that's resonating with me as you talk about our choosing, feeling like you're choosing the fate that is actually kind of you're actually constrained into being
Yeah.
put into too.
So
Yeah.
I took a little sidetrack there, and sorry if I got us off, Betsy.
No, you
But thank you
didn't.
for that.
This is for the chat is just terrific, full
Okay.
of great stuff. So
Yes. Thinking about all of this, Allison, what you've presented so far in your studies, how much is the discipline of sociology a meritocracy, and or how much does it reproduce at a different level the class structure of our larger society?
I think it's very, very little of meritocracy. And I think the fact that we obviously think it is, and we're all invested to some extent in it being a meritocracy. All of us who are faculty, all of us who have PhDs, all of us who go to that have some level of appreciation for intelligence and the mind and all of that, and some commitment to that as well. We read books and we teach about things like, we are smart. And so we believe inherently in a meritocracy based on intellectual capabilities or at least intellectual curiosity. Um, and I think, I don't know the extent to which that is a complete and utter sham. I don't think that it is, but I think the belief in it certainly upholds inequality within our field, right? And makes it seem like it's deserved that um, people who do find positions at Harvard have the extra resources that come with being at positions at Harvard. They're just sort of taken for granted that well, of course, that makes sense, right? Um, and so it's not just the amount of pay. There's all kinds of other perks that occur at different places. I mean, from I interviewed at a place where I went and the toilet was disconnected and sitting on the floor to like you have that like regular okay just work around it. I'm working class, I can do that. To places where you have a secretary who actually answers your email, which is very different. So the pay might be similar, but those perks have a lot of attendant results on productivity and on your self-identity.
we've got some really great questions in the chat. So maybe Terry, before we go on with our prepared questions, we could say what a few chat people have said that I'm not sure if I'm going to say your name right. Enrica says, I'm hoping you can talk more about the way return on investment on education, giving back to families affects the career mobility.
Yeah, definitely. And we have there should be a paper coming out that I'm not working on that shows from the survey we actually got dollar amounts that people received from family and gave back to family. And so it's really interesting like mark where among non-first gen working class people, they get money from their family, and then eventually when they're like 60, they stop getting it. And that's the opposite way for working class people, where they're giving money back, and eventually they stop giving money back, mostly because their parents are now dead. But so, it's just it's a very inverse, different thing. And we don't have any like data that shows what connection that has on outcome other than just, you thinking about it. It's obviously going to have an impact. People whose parents, and there's other people who are studying this, like intergenerational transmissions of wealth come through in all these things that people take for granted, like grandparents paying for childcare, right? But the grandparents have to have money to be paying for the childcare, or a down payment on a house, or one thing I was surprised at, I did a survey a few years back of liberal arts college students, most of them from comfortable backgrounds. And 50% of them had student loans, right? And then I did a little follow-up 6 months later, and like 10% had student loans. And I was like, oh, my data is wrong. No, it just turned out that all of the middle class and upper middle class and upper class kids had their families paid off within 6 months of them graduating, which is not something I've ever heard the news talk about, and something that completely surprised me that it's pretty common. And then I found out it was pretty common among some families that like you let your children take the debt out. They're learning lessons about it, but then once they graduate, you just pay it off for them. And so those are things we don't necessarily talk about or compare about. There's a lot, like comparing money is, you're not supposed to do that. That comes from the people with money, of course. So there's all these ways, that subtle ways that material differences have matter, even on a small level of choosing to teach or work at a place close to your family because the price of a plane ticket is too much. So you want a place that's within driving distance so that you can see them often, right? And that's going to confine your job search for many working class people.
All right, should we ask some more questions of Allison? Let's see. Yeah, so I wanted to connect your work with some of the other investigations of the effect of class background on the on subsequent career, and the class ceiling, the Friedman and Lorison study of in the UK, and of very elite professions like top law firms, top broadcasting. So they found that people from working class backgrounds end up with lower pay and lower status than people from higher class backgrounds. So I just wanted you to connect your work with theirs. And do you think the same thing, that as an individual working class person trying to become a faculty member, what do you think are the disadvantages in trying to get into elite research R1 university jobs?
Yeah. I mean, it's not surprising that academia is like every other discipline in that sense, and it's a sort of cumulative disadvantage. So one of the things, like on an individual level, there's always individual there's Douglases that, I mean, they exist. But a lot of the getting to that top right quadrant is cumulative based on the pathways that you've taken before then. So one of the best predictors in the survey of being at a top uh, university now is being born in the Northeast, because your local college is more likely to be an elite school than you are if you're in the Southwest, right? And so, when you're a working class kid, you don't necessarily know what is an elite school. You just know the school is, you've heard of it. And so if you're in the Northeast, there's a lot of schools that you've heard of that are actually pretty good, in that sense. So, um, there's this sort of sense of these cumulative tracks. And a lot of times what people will find when they say that those the people that push back on class mattering, they'll say, oh, well, no, it's just the people at the top are just people who went to Harvard, so it's not a class problem. And then it's like, well, why are those people who went to Harvard, right? So it you just, go back, right?
Yeah.
So the I think I actually have a little like short laundry list of things that sort of um, make a disadvantage for working class people in sort of advancing and why they might stay closer, other than the obvious ones. And so thinking about this is that sort of like, how are we reproducing class and how are our choices being sort of formed that way? One is that there are just basic structural obstacles in getting into a good graduate program, and with the costs and the knowledge and all those things that people are studying about who goes to grad school and where. So there's that basic thing. But then there's interactional signals about fit, everything from microaggressions and classism and elite spaces that make people turn around and run away, right? And then there's the internalization of inappropriateness, the feeling imposter syndrome, and you're wanting to like be in a place in a space that doesn't make you feel like an imposter. So the cultural microaggressions, but then the sort of internalization. And then I think the interesting thing about the serving students and giving back, there are institutional rewards for that. So they're sometimes not a lot, but there's something, at least an identity and approval. If you can sort of say, I'm at this school that's uh, mostly first gen or has a lot of first gen, and I'm serving them, you're more likely to get on committees at that university and get a pat on the back. So there's all these sorts of institutional rewards for sort of matching your class with your end place. Um, and it's related to that is sort of thinking about using your background as an advantage and where that will work. And so like Douglas used his blue collarness back in the day and it worked, but there was a particular kind of macho blue collarness that was cool in the 70s to other white men that were from the middle class. Not everyone can use their sort of working classness as an advantage. So if you find a place you can, then and you can excel there, then that's another sort of way that people are sort of like pigeonhole themselves even. And then I guess finally, what I've already said about that geographical concordance of being like near home or a place that looks like home and feels like home. And so all those things together are the things I think that really make it difficult for accessing the top spaces and why the whole meritocracy idea. Because it probably works in the inverse for a lot of Arlie Hochschild. I had a colleague whose father came to visit. I won't say his name, but his father came to visit. His father was a professor as well. And his grandfather was a professor, and his great grandfather was a president of a university.
Oh,
And so I went to dinner with my colleague and his father, and the father told me a delightful story about dating Arlie Hochschild in college and how he had rolled up in a Mercedes, and Arlie had said, I can't date you because you're in a Mercedes. Um, so just those sort of mind-blowing stories, right? I'm sure in the inverse it works where people who are from those kinds of backgrounds feel more comfortable in places that reflect that, right? And are not going to feel as comfortable in a place where the toilet's disconnected on the floor. And, that's how class sort of reproduces.
all right. This is fascinating. And as speaking as a fellow sociologist, the it's the downside for sociology. I'd like to hear you address a little that if working class academics mostly end up outside the research universities, is that class sorting distorting the contents of the discipline, the trends, the topics, the ideas that get the most attention, or the ways that the social realities are interpreted? So if you could comment on that,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it is. And I think it's important to have this conversation rather than focus on individuals not getting the top, because a lot of other people will just say it's sour grapes or blame working class people for being envious or something like that. But I think, Betsy, you're absolutely right. I think it's very distorting. We know that having voices from people of color change the dynamic and understanding of a particular field, and that women's voices have changed the academy once they've been inserted and added and invited. And so it just stands to reason that working class voices are also something that could make a difference. Just even think about the weird stuff that was happening after 2016 when everyone was like, who are these strange working class people and why are they voting for this guy? And just the weird conversations that were going on about, like there was this other alien land out there. I think we would have had a more honest discussion and a more just astute discussion had there been other voices in the room other than the ones that were taking up all the air. Um, I also think sociology is really interesting because we study inequality, and to have a field who whose focus from day one, we in case you guys are not all sociologists, I teach sociological theory like our founding fathers, and one of our founding fathers is literally Karl Marx. So as a field that sort of embraces Karl Marx as a founding father, the fact that our discussions of inequality are mostly being shaped by people that have never been poor a day in their lives and that might never have uh, have no understanding of what economic insecurity is or working class culture and working class laughter and laughing in the face of adversity or, just so many things. Um, I think it is, I think it has set us back as a discipline. I think it prevents us understanding the world fully. Um, there's also a weird thing that strikes me is that working class academics in sociology are very common in teaching colleges, and we are teaching a lot of students, and then we're not writing the textbooks. So
Mm.
we're not writing the books that we're teaching, so that also is a really weird lost opportunity, I think, for us. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that too, because it's not something that is like been ironed out, but I definitely think that it just must make a difference. And I've had enough conversations with people from elite spaces with elite backgrounds that seem idiotic when I talk to them about class to know that maybe there's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm seeing Michelle saying back in the 50s, sociology textbooks were extremely classist. I think sometimes they still really are. Oh, should we open it up for discussion, or do you want to ask another question, Terry?
I have one more, and then we'll open it up. One of the most provocative of your ideas is how many faculty, we've been talking about this already a bit, but from working class backgrounds adopt a kind of amour fati, and you had that, I think, in your slide, love of your fate in choosing positions in university and college settings where there's a large working class student presence. We feel more at ease, more comfortable there. We feel more effective.
Yeah.
But how common? There's two questions. How common is what you call amour fati among the sociologists you've studied, and might it possibly undermine us achieving our full potential and then reproduce the class cycle?
Yeah, I think that connects up with what I was just saying about the accessing and who access and the meritocracy as well. And I think based on the data from a heavily dues paying group, right? So it's a very conservative group of sociologists in that sense. Most of them, the plurality were public teachers. So I think that it probably is pretty common. And then also there's not one of the things that I've been wanting the ASA to do is just to take more care documenting the number of first-gen working class faculty there are in the discipline, because I can't really answer the question about how prevalent it is when we don't have the data. So our survey is a good first place, but it's not representative in the sense that the survey went out to ASA members, but it said that it was about first-gen working class faculty. It was open to everyone, and about 30% of the people who took it were first-gen working class. But I wouldn't say that means that 30% of the sociologists are first-gen working class, right? So I think it's weird that we still have this basic lack of data where we have demographic data on women and people of color and nationality. Like we have all this other data and we don't have data on class. So I can't necessarily say that how common it is. A lot of it will still be anecdotal for this point in time. I mean, personally, I would say to be really reflective here, I think I've always tried to fight the system when I see it and try to get like as far up as I can just to see what I'm missing. But then I moved from a small liberal arts college to an R1 Oregon State University to be closer to my family and now primarily teach. I mean, I do research too, but I'm at like teaching. And part of it is some of the things that I was saying is that I wanted to be close to my family, and uh the liberal arts college that I was teaching always had some first gen working class students. And then after the last economic meltdown, they're like, oh, we can't afford these students anymore. So the numbers of working class students dropped from a dismal 10% to like a 2%. And I'm like, I can't justify staying and teaching to nobody who's like me. So I made the jump. I gave up tenure and moved the jump to public teaching, so that I could give back. And with full awareness of, like what that means in terms of placement in the field, because I've been paying attention to it. But still, yeah.
Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, why don't we open this up? The chat is just terrific for those who haven't been reading it. There's questions, comments, and we have a suggested question to pose. Let me get to the I want to do a hand raise. If everybody could open up to the grid video where you see everybody. So let's see. Of course, we're not assuming that people are in academia. These webinars are open to everybody, but I'm just curious how many of us have personal connections to what Allison's talking about. So first, let's do either the little reaction hand raise or a physical hand raise like I'm doing. Okay, if you actually have a sociology degree or work as a sociologist, okay, pretty many, not less than half of who's here, but we've got a good contingent. And then if you have worked in academia or currently work in academia, now raise your virtual or real hands. Okay, looks like about 20 people are raising their hands for that. So we're mixed, but for those of you who have gone to college or taught college, the discussion question we want to suggest, which people have been writing a lot about in the chat, is how do the 4 tracks that Allison laid out resonate with your own experience of going to college or teaching college? And feel free to unmute yourself and speak out loud, or there wasn't everybody put their hand down, and now if you want to raise your hand.
Perhaps stop sharing the screen so we can see.
I thought that maybe people would want to see the 4
Okay.
grid,
Okay.
but yeah, whichever works best for people. But I thought to see her terms and on the grid with um the four cells. So Enrica, am I saying you right? Why don't you unmute yourself and
Yes, you
speak?
are saying it great. Thank you for that pronunciation and checking to see if it was correct. I wanted to say, yeah, thank you for the talk and the presentation. I am one of the Vanessas, for sure. I grew up in the Midwest, in Minnesota in particular, so there was a similar effect. The environment I grew up in, Minnesota is a well-known state for its nonprofit education initiatives. The Twin Cities and Minnesota's budget invest quite a bit of money into the reputation of college-bound, upward-bound initiatives. The nonprofit space, if you want to start an educational nonprofit, go to Minnesota. I mean, it's really well known for that kind of landscape, but to the extent of like it's saturated with colleges. I grew up with them in my backyard, but the impetus to go to college was a part of a racially stigmatizing process. I mean, the assumption was that Black families did not value education in a similar way. I was performing well as like a high achieving, gifted, and talented Black student, but it meant isolating me away from other students of color in order to create the idea that I was uniquely intelligent and ready for AP or IB classes, but my peers were not. Um, and I did not know that I was planning to go to college until I was told like you could do something better with your life, right? Than like reproducing my mom's nursing practitioner, experience and degree or trade. So I was pushed through. I like to say I was pushed through my experience of going to Williams College. Again, I didn't really know I did not know what I was getting. I did not understand what a shift from being a Midwestern Black girl to New England, Williamstown, in the middle of nowhere, um, isolated, no car. I mean, it was a deliberate, intentional campus where the assumption was that you can focus here. Like we have you in Williamstown because this is the privilege that the elite students deserve, a place to go be a child for an extended amount of time with no cameras or surveillance or a city. But actually going to this rural space, predominantly white, private liberal arts college, again, something like a 16% acceptance, 10% acceptance rate. I mean, it was a real sense of like, if you're having a difficult time here, it's your attitude. Like, we have all the resources. We've given you everything you need. You barely had to pay. So lots of pizza, thank you letters to donors. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here for this mortgage level thing. But anyway, I had no background in sociology. It's just to give context. Like, I'm definitely Vanessa in terms of this sense of
Yeah.
when I came into sociology for graduate school, the shift from a private to a big R1 back in the Midwest, being in Ann Arbor, was another shift, another huge sense of like, I need to go to a PWI to succeed in this discipline. It's not possible for me to say go to Howard for sociology, which has a strong tradition, or Emory. Like, it was like I need to be in an R1 and it needs to be predominantly white, and sociology at Ann Arbor is top, number one. So I think this sense that
I
I
think my
was
Bluetooth is connected.
Excuse me, I think someone's unmuted.
my last
Yes.
saying my last thing to not take up time, but the sense of what you talked of, how you described the Vanessas. It was a sense of upward mobility, a clear sense that I was not getting the same returns on my investment to a private liberal arts education as my peers were 4 years out. And then similarly, coming into a really elite sociology program at an R1 university that really did not see class or classism as something their department struggled with. It was like, clearly we are not struggling with helping our working class students because everyone gets out in 5 years or 6, because we fully fund our student, we take care of ours, and it's like, but you're not taking care of me, and that feeling. So I just wanted to say yes, thank you. I felt Vanessa did, and I appreciate the research. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, the chat is just filling up with people's stories. We have 2 people saying I was an Ellen, or I am an Ellen. And then Stacy, do you want to say this out loud about how different things are in the UK? I feel really lucky that this is such an international webinar.
Hi. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Apologies if I sound a bit croaky. I've got a bit of a sore throat, but we're good. And it's also gone midnight here, so I'm trying to be awake. So my point really was, yeah, in the UK we have, I think, so on the graphic you said if you're an academic in the UK, Australia, or another country, how would the diagram be different, right? So I think it would be quite different because we have far fewer universities than in the US. We have, I think it's about 170, 100, maybe slightly less than that, so under 200. And these are predominantly split into what we call Russell Group, elite, research intensive institutions, and then what we might call modern, post 92, new universities, which are predominantly teaching intensive. And we have a small number of institutions, I was only aware of this quite recently, that consider themselves to be traditional because they've been around for a long time, but they're not included in the Russell Group. They're not considered elite or research intensive. But I think the most important thing that I've noticed in the UK context is that certainly over the last, I say recent-ish, the last sort of 10 years or so, maybe a little bit longer, our funding model in the UK, the way that research is funded and the way that student education is funded even, means that research is really heavily cross-subsidized by teaching, and particularly through the fees that we charge to international students, because those are uncapped, and they're only regulated in a very kind of vague sort of sense by the free market. So there has been much more of a focus in the last sort of decade or so on research intensive universities employing people on what they call teaching focused or teaching and scholarship or education focused, or any number of different variations of that term, tracks, because those staff will then have a higher teaching load, and they might have something like myself. I'm an associate professor at Leeds Uni. I'm on a teaching and scholarship route, a teaching and scholarship contract, and that means I have, I would say, sort of I don't know, 80% of my workload is dedicated to teaching and pastoral support and other bits and pieces. And then less than 10% is allocated for what we call scholarship, so pedagogic research. And I think that's a real shift now, because that allows researchers, people on disciplinary research contracts, to move away from teaching a little bit, and to still have the benefit of the income that teaching brings. So I could talk at length about that, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the US is really, really unique. Who else has a question for Allison or a response to our prompt of how you resonate with these categories?
I don't see any hands up.
Michelle Marks has raised her hand. Michelle, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Could you say something about adjuncts, which is, I guess that's part of being like being a Vanessa, being like Vanessa, but I think that's a major thing, the category that a lot of us end up in these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And because, again, because of the nature of the data being pulled from dues paying ASA members, we did not capture a lot of adjuncts. There were many that were in the survey, but I wouldn't say that they were representative because they're still paying a good chunk of change to be a member of ASA. So we do know, from other data sources that first-gen working class people often end up on the adjunct path. Within the data set we have, we didn't necessarily see like a huge difference. So when I said at the beginning, the pay for every different level was more for people who were not first gen working class. We saw that, but one of us on the task force was expecting to see like all the first gen working class people in adjunct and then all the tenure track being middle class. It's not the case. It was very small differences that matter. And then, if you start throwing intersectional variables in there, you get a better profile of who ends up on the adjunct track. But class alone doesn't necessarily do that. There's just a lot of faculty who are being, pushed on the adjunct track, and there are different reasons for it too. Some well-resourced faculty don't mind adjuncting, and that does actually drive some problems for the less economically secure, which is a majority adjunct faculty. So there's a lot to be looked at more within that, and I can't say much from this data about it. That's a good question.
Colin has his, oh, yeah.
Yes.
Collins, why don't you unmute yourself?
Hi. So my personal journey with sociology went from being a classically trained commercial electrician where a company employs us for 40 hours a week, sometimes more, as we are learning the tools of the trade, the skills and stuff like that. They also pay for our schooling one night a week. That is for 4 years until we get our full hours and licensure. In 2020, I took an opportunity to go back to online college, made a hard left turn from electrical engineering to social engineering. So I hold a particularly unique vantage point in seeing and experiencing vocational trade schools and on-the-job training, as well as academia. And when I started my schooling, I refused to not be working while I'm learning. So I've been lecturing and doing TA work in addition to my own research and stuff like that while pursuing my degrees. But there does seem to be a very wide gap between trade and vocational schools and traditional academia. Do we think that particularly for working class individuals, that there are things we could learn from the trade schools and vocational education to apply to people that are wanting to work while they are learning or get their feet wet in the industry as quickly as possible? Or can we learn from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Enrica's story is actually really compelling here, and it happens to a lot of smart working class kids that get sort of put on this academic track and told this is the only way to go, and that vocational training is disparaged or just not discussed. You can do better than that. There's all these like class inflicted, commands and lessons that are being thrown at us. And so yes, I mean, I often joke that I wish I had a parallel degree as an electrician because I think it'd be really helpful and so forth. And it's just part of the whole overall commitment to this academic meritocracy that we stratify skills and knowledge in that way.
Right. I'm going to call on Paul Dean, and I just want to say that you can see this a theme of what in Allison's work and in this conversation of it's not just about money. It's also about culture and class cultural differences. And within Working Class Studies Association, we have a class cultures caucus. And that Allison's in, I'm in, Jack Metzger is in. And after when we got Paul Dean to be our guest speaker a few months ago, we said, Paul, will you join the Class Cultures Caucus? Because that's how you think that way too. So yeah, do you want to unmute, Paul? And we'll just have time for a couple more questions. We want to end on time.
Yeah, and Allison, thank you for your work with ASA and in our field on this. I think it's really enriched, I think, my experience and has enriched, I think, what the field has been doing around first-gen students in particular. So super briefly, I'll give a short version of a response to the question, and then I have a question of my own, but Betsy, you can direct us elsewhere if you need to. But I I knew from an early point in my PhD experience that I wanted to go to a teaching heavy institution. And when I was on the job market, I was lucky enough to have a job offer in hand fairly quickly at a regional public university that served largely working class students. And I was ready to take that. I would have been very happy taking it. But I had another interview at a small liberal arts college as well. And so I went into that interview with this job offer in hand. And my big question was, if I go to this private institution that has a really heavy price tag, is this institution going to be just serving a lot of privileged kids? And to be honest, I probably had that working class chip on my shoulder of like, oh, are these going to be a bunch of snobby kids? I don't want to be a bunch of, working with just all these privileged kids. And sure enough, I learned that at least at this institution, which is where I'm at now, Ohio Wesleyan University, that we serve a pretty significant first-gen population as well as a lot of Pell eligible students. And so those are the students who I tend to work with. And I have found that my work in this similar area has been valued on my campus. And by and large, my colleagues are receptive to the work and continuing to grow their own skills in serving a first-gen population. But my question, if we have time for it, though, is I'm curious if in your interviews, Allison, if your interviewees talked about facing, we'd call it color blindness if we were talking in racial terms, but a class blindness at their institutions when they were trying to push their institutions to better serve first-gen students, if you came across that, and what kinds of strategies you saw them employing.
I actually have I have a bone to pick here, or an answer I think that I would like to say, and Enrique reminded me of why I wanted to say it. There's in my experience, I was also at an elite small liberal arts college, and they also liked the idea of supporting first-gen students, but only within this framework of we're doing good for first-gen students, we're being benefactors. And there's this benefactor mentality. Whenever I raise the issue of class, looking at class across the class spectrum, so let's talk about class privilege, I got pushback. So I was allowed to talk about class if I was helping poor kids. And I have a paper out with Debbie Warnock called The Poor Kids Table, which is about organizing students at a small liberal arts college. So you could do that kind of work. And the students have to bend over backwards and telling stories about, again, writing thank you letters and like, oh, I've been benefited by you, great institution. But anything about the privileges of the class of the other 80% of the students are just like off the table. So yeah, that's my short angry response, but yeah.
All right, why don't we say Tammy, is that how you pronounce your name? Why don't you have the last word, and then I've got a closing slide and some announcements. So why don't you unmute yourself and
Hi, thanks so much. I really appreciate this event. I live in Canada now, but I'm from Australia, and I would say with regard to your question about whether UK and Australia would be different, I did my PhD in the UK. I've been all over, but university education for people of my generation, I'm 40, is far less of a marker of class, or at least the income aspects of class, because when my parents were of university age and they were non-English speaking immigrants, working class immigrants to Australia in the 70s, education in Australia was 100% free and universal, higher education. And they would not have been able to attend university and do all the degrees they did had that not been the case. So there was this rare glory moment in our history when that was the case. And by the way, so was healthcare at that time. And so if they hadn't been able to do that, there's no way I would have been able to then get an education at a time when it was no longer free, although much cheaper than it is in the US, I acknowledge. And so I think that's kind of interesting. But then they got PhDs, and then they actually became downwardly mobile when the stock market crashed and there was a global financial crisis. And in the end, myself and my brother are actually supporting my dad, who would be homeless if it weren't for us supporting him. despite that I'm from very credentialed, like, parents. So I think it's very interesting the use of the language first gen, because I don't think that that would be as quite easily applicable, or it wouldn't be as much of a marker of class where I'm from as it is in the stories you're describing, from what I can gather. So I just thought I'd share that, I guess, as a way of complicating it even further, which I'm sure is what you want at this point. But yeah, thank you so much for everybody's contributions. I learned a lot tonight. Thank you.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good wrap up comment. Thank you, Tammy. And yeah, I just want to this is a bi-monthly series. And thanks to Terry for stepping in as a co-facilitator. Usually it is Jack Metzger, who will be back with us in May. So yeah, it's great. I'm seeing a lot of appreciation in the chat. So I know a lot of us have American politics in on our minds these days. We're really in a crisis state here. Dino Coastella is a Teamster, Director of Operations, a Teamster Local, and the Director of the Center for Working Class Politics. Is really a provocative thinker on the topic of how Democrats can win back working class voters. What has gone wrong with so many working class Trump voters, et cetera. So we would love to see you all back again on May 8th. And you can go to classmatters.org to see the link to Eventbrite there for the next one. And you also can go to classmatters.org to get the recordings of the past Talking Class webinars. So this has been a pleasure. Thanks to everybody who stayed until the end here. And especially, of course, thanks to Allison. And we hope to see you in May.
Thank you, everyone.